It's down here. Sorry for the last minute switcheroo, but this is a bigger and better space, so we're happy to be here. I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the executive director of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, and today's talk and discussion, as you can see, are on the record and will be recorded, but please no photography or recording in the room. We will take care of that part. So we are absolutely thrilled today to have with us Mitch Presnick, a visiting fellow of practice at the Fairbank Center, who knows as much about China as anyone I know. He's a graduate of Beida and then spent 30 years in China and Hong Kong building businesses from Super 8 hotels to the lobbying company APCO China, learning on the ground the rough and tumble, highly competitive nature of business in China. Mitch has been working diligently on ideas around a new paradigm for Western businesses in China, advocating for a new kind of business engagement that will take a page from the Chinese playbook. We can't wait to hear his ideas. And we are also delighted that Professor Bill Kirby will join us as moderator today. Bill Kirby is the T.M. Chang Professor of China Studies and the Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration. And having spent many, many hours with China's top entrepreneurs and CEOs in the course of writing case studies and teaching about business in China, Professor Kirby also knows as much about China and its history as just about anyone I know. So over now to our two wonderful Chinese speakers.
Well, I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to first introduce my co-author and research assistant on this piece. That's James B. Estes, who came down from St. Paul's School in New Hampshire today to be with us. So welcome, JB. So today we're here to discuss a provocative idea, and that idea is that perhaps leveraging China's strengths is a preferable option for pursuing Western objectives than decoupling. I start from the position of what I know, which is the multinational corporation landscape, a place I come from. And I then will lead into some implications for folks that are in other spaces besides the business space. But that's where we're going to start. So the idea, I think, that really captivated my attention when I first thought about this with JB was, what did China do well when it was going through its beginnings, when it started the 改革开放 reform movement in 1978? What did they do well? And what they did well was they put aside their ideology and they decided to approach their opening with a lot of humility and a lot of pragmatism. And as we look at the landscape we're in now, where China is starting to lead in industry after industry, technology after technology, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to look at if that isn't something that we could learn from them? So we identified 4 key strengths of the Chinese economy, and we then looked at how Western multinationals could leverage those strengths. The first strength is its innovation ecosystem. Now, a lot of people will tell you that China is good at iterating, but isn't particularly good at innovating. That is about a 5 to 8 year lag idea. In fact, now China is very much innovating, and they're ranked 10th in the world in terms of innovation economies. Now, that is quite something for an economy that wasn't even listed in the top 50 just 10 years ago. So when we're looking at how they innovate, their innovation methodology is very different from ours. Whereas we rely on entrepreneurship and a profit motive, for them it's a state capital hybrid blend where top-down government industry meets bottom-up Chinese entrepreneurship fervor and intensity. What it creates is a whole-of-nation approach. A whole-of-nation approach which actually has increased their R&D spend from less than 20 billion in 1995 to over 620 billion in 2021. That number is now, by the way, over 800 billion. So we're talking about an enormous amount of R&D that is vertically integrated, centrally planned, but also has a ton of entrepreneur. In other words, they're basically bringing the best of both models together to innovate around key technologies that the government has identified, along with industry and with science and with academia as being key to the future, which is why, according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, China now leads the US in 53 out of 64 areas of critical technology. That is everything from information and commercial and communication tech, all the way to materials and manufacturing, AI, biotech, gene sequencing, vaccines. Traditionally areas where we thought in the West that we were far ahead, actually that lead is either negligible or they've actually come to par. This isn't just my opinion. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, just last week at Harvard Kennedy School said exactly the same thing. So just in case you think that I'm on a fringe, well, the former CEO of Google agrees with us. Now, if we were to look at companies that are doing a good job of harnessing China's skills in this area, one of them that we'd have to look at is a US energy producer called Invenergy. Invenergy is a company that basically, the leading US company in alternative energies. They set up a 51-49 JV with China's largest solar manufacturer, LONGi, that now produces 5 gigawatts of solar panels annually and employs over 1,000 American workers in Ohio. Now, just to let that sink in the middle of all of this trade war talk, a company is set up and is successfully operating under a very different model than the one we're hearing about in the mainstream press. And I believe that is an interesting model because it accomplishes two things. It transfers technology where China has a lead, and it also allows for US to reshore, or in some cases friendshore, manufacturing in areas where the US is trying to get back into par status. Ford's another company that is successfully using this model and successfully leveraging China's innovation advantages. Ford has recently set up a JV with CATL, the large Chinese battery manufacturer. They're producing state-of-the-art product in Michigan. It's a $3.5 billion factory, and the results are exceeding expectations. So just putting this out, these are right now just data points that don't really show a trend, but they are very much an idea which we can build upon. And I would say in light of the election yesterday, I think there's something that we can certainly talk about later in terms of how much support a new administration will have for these ideas. And the answer is much more than the previous one. Now, let's talk about the Global South for a minute. The Global South is an area people talk about BRI and what does it all mean. China now trades more with the developing world than with the developed world. So that's a massive change. It's never happened in our lifetimes, okay? The traditional, conventional view is that China relied on Western markets, and that was actually the case up until about 8-10 years ago. But as we all know, China time runs at about 3 times Western time. So that's like 30 years ago to them. Right now, they are very much the largest trading partner for 140 countries around the world. Let that sink in for a minute. There's 190 or 95 countries in the world. They're the leading trading partner for most of them. And the BRI is built on top of that. Now, BRI, people can have different views on how effective it is and whatever, but here's what it absolutely is. It is a delivery system for nomenclatures and standards that will become the standards in the developing world forever. Gauges on high-speed rail, measurements for 5G stations. All of that follows the Chinese nomenclature now. That's what really this is about. And it's also air cover for Chinese multinationals to sell product in. So all of a sudden, when you start looking and you step back, what you see is a manufacturing powerhouse that is driven by automation, 2 generations ahead of our automation and manufacturing now, 1.5 to 2, robotics, et cetera. And it is set up in such a way so that when those nations develop into middle-class economies, consumption-based, China is perfectly positioned to sell into those markets. So BRI is misunderstood by many people as something designed to try to pursue some sort of a national security goal. But actually what we found in our data in our data collection is it's far more pragmatic than that. Okay. In terms of companies that have successfully ridden this trend, Transsion, Xiaomi, Huawei. China controls 86% of Latin American EV manufacturing export. Okay, Huawei itself supplies 70% of Africa's 4G network. These kind of numbers are not small numbers. They are basically, it's China and the rest of the world combined in terms of comparison. It's not even a US-China comparison in most of these segments that we saw. A company that has successfully used China's strengths in the developing world to its advantage is Cummins. Cummins is an American manufacturer of engines, and instead of doing what most American companies did when asked to produce 50-50 JVs, Cummins really leaned into it. Cummins decided this was an opportunity for them to learn from their Chinese partners, which include Dongfeng, the biggest ones, Foton, Liaogong. And what they discovered by these 6 JVs was that they could achieve a China price and create product that they had never thought to produce, but it was appropriate for China, it was appropriate for India, it was appropriate for Thailand. And all of a sudden, Cummins is now generating more than 50% of their business in the developing world because of their ties with China and the JV they created there, the JVs they created there. So I just wanted to mention that even in that area, some American companies, and there's others too we can talk about in the Q&A, have decided to lean into China's initiatives in the global south. All right, China's ultra competitive market is something I know very well. I would love to sometime sit down with you guys over a beer and talk about what it's like trying to develop an economy hotel chain in China. It's a gladiator's arena. It's cutthroat in a way that I can't properly describe. Everything is trying to kill you. Everything is trying to kill you. Your competitors are obviously trying to kill you. I would sit on a stage with the founders of my competitors, Jiqi and Shen Nanpeng, and they would basically spend half the time just talking about how I didn't belong on the stage. And they would go out of their way to try to keep Xiecheng and Yilong from listing our properties, all kinds of ways. The local governments were, of course, they were sort of in a mixed situation. Some of them loved having a brand like Super 8. Others really wanted to support their local heroes. So there was a very competitive market on the competitor side in ways I'm probably not able to fully describe. Even my partners were trying to kill me. They were trying to keep me from, they were constantly trying to renegotiate their agreements by withholding fees, by withholding compliance. So in the middle of that, my customers were trying to kill me too, because they were constantly trying to withhold payments or ask for discounts, or we had an enormous amount of pressure from the entire market. Budweiser, the same thing. The idea that Western multinationals have an easy time, let me tell you something. Multinationals in China are Darwinian wonders. They're able to survive and thrive in a vat of acid. The ones that have done well are able to go anywhere in the world. There is no place that we can't go now after we've competed in China. If you can make it in China, then the US is like a cakewalk. I mean, I've run a couple businesses since here, and it's just like, oh my God, there's a regulatory environment to protect me. And oh my God, my competitors aren't trying to kill me nearly as viciously as my Chinese competitors were. But I'll tell you one thing, that is the standard now. If you can compete in China, that means you can compete with Chinese multinationals everywhere. And that's why Super 8 is now developing in 25 different markets. So this is what I'm trying to convey, is that this idea that there's a China market and one can choose to be in it or not, that's actually a very outmoded idea now. The idea is, if you're able to compete in China, that gives you a story that'll allow you to compete everywhere. And I think one of the best example that I'll bring today is Tesla. Tesla, basically, in the early years, let's be honest, I mean, China encouraged them to join, their industry because they wanted to have access to Tesla's know-how and their ideas. But very quickly, Xpeng and NIO and BYD and others, they actually surpassed Tesla in terms of product iteration cycles, because they were all created in a tech world, not in an automotive world. So here in the US, the iteration cycles run about 2 to 4 years. for a product cycle. In China, it's less than 1 year. And the other requirement is each successive iteration must be cheaper than the last one. So Tesla had to then retool its entire operations. It had to go through 4 different price cuts in 1 year, 2023, just to stay competitive in China. But now, as a result, their Model Y is the best-selling car in the entire world because they were able to survive and somehow stay competitive in the China gladiators arena. Finally, I want to talk about China's 1.4 billion customers and why that's significant. Now, everybody knows it's a big deal, and everybody always assumes that multinational companies like Budweiser and Super 8, that we're just a bunch of capitalists wearing top hats and wearing little monocles and we're chasing dimes. It's actually very different from that. When you're actually in it, what we are is heavily focused on trying to de-risk our businesses globally. And if you're not in China, accessing China customers, then you don't really get access to the most demanding customers in the world, and you don't get access to that volume of revenue that's available, which then you will then plow into R&D. So if you were to, and we'll have data to show this, JB and I have data to show this, but if you were to look at a company like Qualcomm or NVIDIA just surpassed Apple again as the world's most valuable company. That would never have happened if they hadn't made so much of their revenue in China and then proportionally plowed it into R&D. So what we're discovering in example after example after example is that it's far more nuanced an idea that China has a huge market than just it's a big market and of course businesses want to make money there. That might have been true 25, 30 years ago. General Motors for many years made much more money in China than the US. Many companies, I can say the same thing about Apple makes more money in China than the US. I know that's a shock. Maybe not forever because they've been a victim of the US-China tech war and other things. But nonetheless, that's where they've been for many years. And because China accounts for 17% of global GDP, and the fact that they have, at least if they continue to grow at roughly a 5% pace, they're going to add an economy that surpasses the size of India, Indonesia, and Japan over the next 8 years, just with their incremental GDP growth. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand that it's not just the point where they are, but the vector. And if they do continue to grow the way that they're growing right now, and that's something certainly people can talk about, but if they do, then you're not just foregoing a current market, you're foregoing a market that is larger than many major G7 markets right now, okay? And then I give a cautionary tale. JB and I looked at Amazon, and Amazon is a stalwart of American industry here, and it's a company that has disrupted Kmart and Walmart, even to a certain degree, and obviously mom and pops, and you could go on and on. But in China, they really didn't take the market seriously enough. They invested a very small amount of money, 75 million, to acquire a company, Joyo.com. They never really fully committed to the market. They ran everything out of their headquarters in the US. They didn't have a fully enfranchised management team. So by the time they got to 2011, although they had reached 15% of the national Chinese online commerce business, but by 2019, they were down to 1%. And the reason is because their competitors, Alibaba and JD.com, decided to ensure that the logistics infrastructure allowed them to get to the last mile very quickly. And they created, because the customers demanded it, they created an incredibly fast delivery system that Amazon, for whatever reason, decided they didn't want to invest behind to match. So they left the market. Makes sense? They weren't making money, they leave the market. But here's what happened. Pinduoduo, which everybody knows is Temu, and then Shein, they basically had a different idea. They said, let's disrupt the Chinese e-commerce market, which they did. And they took a huge bite out of JD.com and Alibaba. And by doing that, they then generated huge volume revenue, and they were then able to enter the US market with $5 billion of annual advertising spend because they made their money in China. In other words, because Amazon didn't pin down Pinduoduo in China, they ended up watching Pinduoduo achieve customer unique visits that are like half of Amazon's customers' visits. And they did it in like 2 years. Amazon worked on this for 20 years to just have that. So this is the point, is that the idea that an American multinational can be safe in its home market or in its developed world markets it's now a questionable idea that doesn't bear up to scrutiny. So our point is this. Our point is that it's time for multinationals to flip this paradigm. It's time for them to get into the age we're in, which is 2024, where China leads in 53 out of 64 categories of critical technology, according to one very hawkish think tank in Australia. And that's, if anyone's interested in the basis under which they've researched this, it's fairly rigorous. This isn't just the South China Morning Post and they read a couple articles. We'll talk about that. But in every area, from defense, space, robotics, energy and infrastructure, quantum, sensing, timing, navigation, and AI, even materials, China is now leading in all of these areas. And this paradigm that we have has to flip. And companies like Ford and Tesla, Cummins and Invenergy are just examples. There's European examples that we'll talk about in the Q&A as well, but they're just examples of ways that Western multinationals can actually leverage Chinese economic strengths in 2024 for their own strategic interests.
Presentation, Mitch, and thank you both for this excellent Harvard Business Review article, which I urge everyone to read if you haven't read it already. I was looking over this list of several critical technologies. It looks like the Americans are still ahead in atomic clocks, but that's about it. I don't know if this is circulated to the rest or not. It's an interesting thing. And I was in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, and I passed by the Super 8 hotel in right off Wangfujing.
Right.
There, I'm sorry, I stayed in another hotel.
Okay.
If that's okay. Let me just, I think this is a powerful article about Chinese innovation and about many things, including also the power of state planning and the intersection of state planning with entrepreneurship. I'm going to come back to that. A couple of minor points that are worth, when you think of this in this moment in time, your recommendations make a certain compelling sense. You have companies who are doing business in China for China, but also for other areas that are not in the West. And that actually is, in many cases, a very successful model still today. Trying to have somehow or other at this moment in time, this technology and Chinese innovation benefit also this country is 比较复杂一点. Just a little more complicated, because if you mentioned the CATL battery plant in Michigan, and Ford had to stop work on it after a UAW strike, and then 2 congressional investigations. It's been scaled back from $3 billion to $2 billion. And so on. And it's a great shame in my view. But you see the political pushback. We'll see if that continues or does not continue. In Invenergy and Longyi, that factory in Ohio, here Invenergy this came up. Wang Shi led a delegation of people here at Harvard Business School a couple of weeks ago who are in renewable energy industries, and Longyi had been discussed seeking tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act for their thing. It was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But then there's legislation in Congress, such as the American Tax Dollars for American Solar Manufacturing Act, that makes that impossible, seemingly foolishly in my view. Xiaomi, I just visited the Xiaomi electric vehicle factory in Beijing, the coolest car I've seen in a very long time, so much better than a Tesla. I will never buy a Tesla.
Yeah.
I just want to make that publicly clear here. But so much better than a Tesla. And it's BYD that has overtaken Tesla in global sales not makes in individual models, but
That's right.
in global sales. One concern we have, of course, is the Biden administration has enacted 100% duty, mistaken on this. Europeans not quite so high. I don't know how terribly sorry.
Same thing.
I don't know how the Trump administration, the incoming one, could outdo the 100%, but you never know. But I think one thing to watch out for is as Chinese EV manufacturers move to Latin America, to Spain and the EU, Hungary and elsewhere, are they going to replicate in those places the price war in China, which will then actually make it very difficult for them or anybody else to make money in the industry. But let me take a kind of a broader look back, since I do history as well as contemporary business. So much of this article really is also about what sometimes is positively and negatively called industrial planning, choosing what industry to invest in. And I think, as many of you know, this is not new. It doesn't just start in 1978. It goes back at least in the 20th century to the earlier days of the Republic. No book is more influential on this than Sun Yat-sen's International Development of China, his Shurye Jihua, which was gospel for Kuomintang for decades into the Taiwan period. A plan to build a railway network that has now been built and exceeded, plan to build deep water ports for imports and exports, plan to build the Three Gorges Dam project, and plan to do it predicated, as your cases show, on cooperation with Western firms. As he put it, using Western capitalism to build Chinese socialism. And he believed very strongly in this idea of technocracy leading the way of industrial planning, called it the dictatorship of the engineers. And there are probably worse dictatorships than dictatorships of the engineers. And you know, these plans formed the basis of China's post-war plan, also for China's first 5-year plan, and so on, and for many of the plans that would be implemented in time in Taiwan. You know, it's central to Taiwan's miracle is the intersection of broad range economic planning by the same economic bureaucracy from the mainland with entrepreneurship. And so on. I had lunch a couple of weeks ago in Taipei, 3 weeks ago in Taipei with Morris Chang, who was lured to Taiwan from Texas Instruments by Li Guoding, this, you know, the ultimate technocrat to establish TSMC. So you have this pattern of state planning tied to entrepreneurship and management. That's the playbook the PRC picks up again in the 1980s, with the difference, and this is where it might get more complicated for today, with the difference, of course, that it isn't just one government. There are many governments involved in this process. You may have state planning initiatives or the ideas in Beijing with this, we ought to be in this or that sector, but which ministry in Beijing and who in Beijing. And local governments are the lead actors in taking the lead. I think your cases show that, but it's worth enterprising. And local governments when most successful when they're tied to real private entrepreneurs. Now, before we wax lyrical about the omniscience of Chinese government planners, we have to remember the catastrophes visited upon the Chinese people by the PRC's relentless efforts at another kind of engineering, social engineering, a land reform that stole land from farmers, a Great Leap Forward that killed 40 million people and set China backward while the rest of East Asia rushed forward, a cultural revolution that veered towards civil war, or a family planning policy that put the government into every bedroom. Very unsuccessful at that, perhaps better like the Republic of China at real engineering than social engineering, and better in part because it had been so backward and remained so backward through the PRC period, through the Maoist period, and so on. It enjoyed way more than the rest of East Asia during this period of post-war boom, the advantages, Gershon-Cronian advantages of backwardness. You know, how does the cell phone industry take off so fast and so enormously in China, faster than in the United States or in Western Europe? Because the landline system was shit, and nothing had been invested, nothing had been invested in this. I mean, I remember when I was a graduate student or assistant professor in Shanghai in the 1980s. Shanghai had 3 phone systems dating from the 1930s, all of them terrible. And you could always hear when somebody was listening in on your call, usually local police, but never, you could, because it was such a poor system of surveillance and communication. So you see this leapfrogging over this. You see it in so many industries and of course, roads and railroads as well. But the successes that you tout really are the results, in some ways, of a troika. And it'd be worth figuring out where do the best ideas actually come from for this or that industry. We have this evidence in the case of Taiwan, but not so much from Beijing. This troika of ideas, at least associated with the central government, local governments determined to both, or liberated to follow those ideas and determined to compete brutally one with another, and local entrepreneurs. It's a brutally competitive and, as you show, also incredibly inefficient system. And so there's a kind of I would ask you for a chicken and egg question. Which of these is, in your view, more important or not? Now, we do have to remember that many of the most successful businesses don't come from state planning, but from private entrepreneurs providing services and technology that no government ministry ever thought of doing. Alibaba is a key example of this, making national markets, people doing business with each other over provincial boundaries in a way that has never been possible before in Chinese history. No government ministry had that idea. Or Didi and ride-hailing services, mobile bikes, and so smaller industries as well as big ones. Industries that all thrive until the government thinks they get too big or too disruptive, and then they are regulated to death. That's a limitation perhaps for some of the industries that you're talking about as well. And let us hope now. I really like that Xiaomi car. And I really am sold on the new trifold phone from Huawei, which I saw on sale for $3,000 US. Anyway, a challenge is real challenge now, particularly since you focus so much on clean tech industries. Given the brutal competition between firms in China and between local governments in China in these industries, including EVs, it's actually almost impossible to make money on these.
That's right. That's right.
And when this delegation came to HBS a few weeks ago, why were they seeking to go global? And particularly to the United States, but also Western Europe or anywhere, because they couldn't make money in China. And I hope for the sake of the Chinese people that you're right, that the current projected rates of growth are realized. But China has been in a serious recession, high unemployment, local governments out of money, fleecing successful local businesses. It's one of those. I remember studying in the Republican period how local governments would raise money when they would run out. They would raise taxes in advance. And so in Sichuan in 1932, the governor of Sichuan was collecting the land tax for 1972.
Yeah.
It's a very, today they don't do that. They collect it in arrears. Yeah, here's a new tax and you owe it for the last 10 years. And it's not even a tax because we can't do taxes. It's a fee or a customary whatever. And so on. Never say that in the realm of taxation that Chinese are not innovative, incredibly innovative in this regard. But let us just hope, and I will stop here, that your more optimistic take on where this will take these industries in China, but also these industries globally, is more accurate than my kind of worries in this regard.
I think the reality is China's economy is Schrodinger's cat. It is both failing and succeeding spectacularly at the same time, and it depends on whether you're viewing it a certain way or another way. And both are actually completely true, depending on the point of view you're seeing it. Look, one thing that JB wrote, which I thought was maybe the best single sentence in this piece, was he said, "The process that China uses to develop new industries is colossally wasteful but devastatingly effective." Now, devastatingly effective is different from devastatingly profitable, but effective in terms of end-to-end control of an industry, and it becomes very difficult. Even, I'm going to quote from Eric Schmidt. China is a full spectrum competitor, not a near peer. The US is going to have a hard time catching up to China in any of the areas that China already dominates, which is most. And the entire value chains around batteries, electric vehicles, and about 10 other areas have been won by China already, and it's very hard to catch up. He specifically mentions that money won't do it. Even if we invest very large sums of money, there's very little chance of dislodging. So if you're looking at it in terms of the traditional view of profit motive of Western multinationals, it's very hard to justify any of this. But if you're talking about taking a few pages from China's playbook and using a whole of nation approach, and multinationals, instead of becoming an impediment to US national security goals, become a security prong. Something that, if you look at, I'm a huge admirer, I have to say, my religion is, I believe in two things, the power of positive energy applied to higher purpose goals, and I believe in a reasonable rate of return. So, I'm already a huge fan of the modern multinational company. The American version of it, I believe, is the most important invention that America has ever created. And it's probably, in some ways, the most appropriate segment of Western strength to actually compete with China. Because again, we are the ones that have successfully been able to, in many cases, compete and thrive and adapt to the Chinese market. So that gives us a unique perspective here. And that perspective is that, frankly, we need to be pursuing goals that the US considers important on a national level, such as reshoring manufacturing, such as technology transfer, such as getting access into markets in the global south. We need to be leveraging China's strengths, specifically because multinationals are well suited to those kinds of efforts. Instead of the US approaching decoupling and de-risking as synonymous ideas, it now becomes antithetical ideas, that you're looking at multinationals with US government support actually helping to pursue goals that the US has already stated are important. Now, there's some areas that just decoupling and de-risking are synonymous, such as AI, such as advanced ceramics, and other things that might have military applications. But the idea of a small yard, high fence has already gone by the wayside, because they're already talking now about, well, a chip that you could make in a toy could be used in a whatever. And so at that point, even DOD has to say to Congress, look, guys, we need the parts from DJI for our drones. We can't have you guys sanctioning them because we need them. That's how bad it's gotten, where, so we need a whole of country approach like China has done. We actually need to get around this. Academia, R&D, science and tech, of course business, of course US military and Western military, and look at how do we coordinate a response which takes into account the strengths that we all bring to it. And that's exactly what China has done successfully. We need to expand our mind to understand that reciprocity is what we're after. If there is one single thing that I hope to achieve with this article, it's I hope to offer new suggestions for the most hawkish members of Western security policymakers and the folks in the three-letter agencies, because those are the folks that actually should be hearing this message, that there's maybe a way to leverage US multinational and Western multinational strength for these ideas. So in other words, this isn't the purpose of the article, and it's certainly not an area that I feel comfortable talking about. We have real security experts in the room, people like Professor Wu and Professor Erickson, and Professor Ross. But for me, my purpose is to say, hey guys, I'm just the kid in the Emperor's New Clothes story here. I'm just pointing at the emperor and I'm saying, there's something off here. Like this is, and I'm bringing specifically a non-academic point of view, because I'm not an academic, and an academic would probably think differently about these things, but I'm bringing whatever I can bring, my experience in China, and I understand that we learned from them in Super 8. That's how Super 8 survived. We became very Chinese. We became as Ben-tu-hua as we possibly could in the marketplace, because we knew that if we tried to operate like a foreign brand, we were going to fail. Very few companies in China do that. But the ones that do are the ones that are the most successful. KFC, McDonald's, Cummins. You can go down the line of successful Western multinationals, and they've all learned from China from a place of pragmatism and reciprocity. And reciprocity, I think, applies both to how multinationals can compete. Yes, there may be new paradigms created about profitability, but I think in the end, what China has shown is that their companies are very successful despite lower margins. Alibaba runs a much lower margin than Amazon, and always will, because the Chinese market will not permit them to make a 15%, NP. But the reality is that if you're used to 8%, you can go into any market in Africa or Latin America, and they will love your product there. And that's actually something that we need to be looking at now, is a multi-tiered strategy that involves whole of nation effort. And that's kind of
one thing that if anyone were to look at this list where China leads in critical technologies, it's in the article in a different way. None of this is possible without the extraordinary investment in education, and particularly higher education, over the last 30 years, and particularly over the last 25 years, or 27 years or so. And and at the same time, we see in the United States a disinvestment in public higher education and the great public research universities of the United States since 2008 in 43 out of 50 American states. Yeah. So we're going one way and they're going another. One way to get around that, of course, is to cooperate more with these leading Chinese universities. Tsinghua is sometimes ranked as the #1 engineering school in the world. Harvard, we have an engineering school also. I think we're number 28 in the United States. And God knows where we're at. There is another one in Cambridge. I forget the name, or down the street. So the Americans are not hopeless in this regard. But the trajectory is not good, because you have this cultural war between academia and government that really threatens excellence. But that's a different topic. I want to open things up now to those who have questions. And if people would identify themselves, please, as they speak. Oh, you need a microphone before you can do anything. Thank you, so that we can record it properly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mitch. This is such a wonderful speech. Not only because the depths of it, but
identify yourself. Please,
oh yeah,
for everybody today.
Well, my name is Qixuan. I'm a second-year MPA student from Harvard Kennedy, and I also do dual degree with Stanford MBA. So I just want to say thank you so much, because not only because of the depths of this research, but I also want to thank you for your courage that speak some facts about China, especially under the circumstances that it is quite a political right to be more hawkish on the China side. So I want to put my MBA hat right now and ask you, because you mentioned so much right now, the China technology is better than the US side, and with the new president coming, I believe that there will be more offshoring opportunity in United States, that there probably more collaboration between these two countries. And what do you think the Chinese entrepreneur could do during this process? And do you feel there will be any opportunities during this transaction process? Thank you so much.
Well, I'm going to make a comment, and then JB, if you want to add anything, feel free. So, yeah, you mentioned that we have a new administration coming. In this area specifically, we know that President Trump has already mentioned the idea of encouraging Chinese investment in U.S. EV production. So we do know that there is a little bit of a change in potential direction on how Chinese technology might be socialized here in the U.S. That's something that I think is quite notable. People focus a lot with President Trump on the fact that he would like to see tariffs increase to 60%, as soon as he enters office. But what he's also talked about is very pragmatic ideas about how the U.S. could be leveraging China's strengths as well. So perhaps that's a bright spot for Chinese entrepreneurs. What we've discovered is it actually makes a lot of sense for Chinese entrepreneurs to be looking at the developing world as much as the developed world. I think that's in some ways an easier road to hoe, if you will, because in those areas, there's just an enormous amount of need. China has an enormous advantage. Obviously, the US offers or can deny market access. The most interesting thing about a tariff is that it's a great tactic, but it's a terrible strategy, right? So right now, if these tariffs are instituted for the purpose of encouraging or compelling Chinese manufacturers to transfer key technologies in some of these critical areas to US companies, that would be exactly what China did for 30 years to American companies, by the way. And so it would be hard for China to say that's an outrageous idea, because that's what they successfully did. And Microsoft and Apple and other companies offered their source code because they decided that the ability to enter the China market and operate freely there was worth transferring key technologies. If we were to do the same thing here, and Chinese entrepreneurs in the tech space were to benefit from that, I'm not sure I see the downside. And if there needs to be any more persuasion, it's exactly what China would recommend we do. If they were advising us on how to catch up in some of these areas, that's exactly what they would recommend. So, I mean, I think we're still in the early days of how everything is going to shake out. But one thing we know for sure is, at least here at Harvard, you know, we've got Eric Schmidt at HKS basically sharing these ideas now. So we're not a lone candle in the darkness anymore. There's other voices that are starting to talk about this. It will pick up steam very quickly. Within 1 year, we should assume that some of these ideas will start to become very interesting, and will start to get the proper hearing that they deserve.
Did you want to add
Yeah, did you want to add anything on there? Okay, great. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much, Mitch. I'm David Wu. I'm a postdoc, a fellow at Fairbank Center. I have 5 questions here, but I'm just going to pick one.
Yes.
So I feel like the success of a lot of Chinese firms also highly depend on the ability of these firms to exploit the workers. For example, I feel like, I mean, the culture of 九九六 is pretty prevalent in a lot of tech companies, and that is something I can hardly imagine most American firms can do. So my question is, to what extent do you think the success of these Chinese companies can be attributed to this, you know, more laxing regulation on workers? And if we are going to replicate this model in America, how successfully can we do that?
It's a great question. JB, you have anything you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that Mitch and I have argued a lot in this paper is that U.S. companies need to be partnering with China, and the beauty of a partnership is that you leverage 2 strengths, and when you have 2 separate strengths, they work well together. So I think, obviously, like you mentioned, Chinese companies may have sort of more lax regulations in terms of that cannot be replicated in the U.S. But I think on a separate note, like, for example, we argue Cummins in our paper, they go into China and they have the Chinese OEMs who have their strengths, and Cummins have their know-how strengths, and together, combining strengths, they can then succeed. So I think that although there are 2 different sort of like perspectives, like you said, the Chinese companies have this, US companies have that. So I think merging strengths that may or may not be replicable in both countries is where you can find common ground and succeed.
Yeah, we were looking at third-party markets as particularly interesting opportunities for cooperation, because, as you say, different regulatory environments, you know, present very unique challenges. I will say that when we researched this, we looked a lot at the idea of how much how much subsidies played a role, and how much of China's low-cost labor played a role. It all plays a role. None of those individual factors are you know, 决定的因素. The deciding factor, but they all combine together to create advantages which are really hard to replicate. But nonetheless, I think JB's point is my point as well, which is, you know, there are times, you know, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu competitor will oftentimes bring their competitor closer to them in order to reduce the risk of getting hit, right? In other words, there are times that decoupling is antithetical to de-risking. And it's times like that where you want to say, okay, well, I mean, China is going to have its low-cost labor. China is going to have its relatively lax labor regulatory environment. That's not going to change. It's also not going to change that there's an entire world out there that is basically going to be acquiring Chinese technology, Chinese products, Chinese exports, or US ones, or a combination of all of the above, including Western companies. It does require a paradigm shift. Let me be clear. This is not an idea that today we could walk into the boardrooms of the Fortune 100 and say, hey guys, in every case you should be doing this. But in many cases, we should be doing this. It will require, though, new thinking in our policy making. It will require some new thinking in other ways. But I think the upside, if we can get over those challenges, I think would be meaningful, because a couple of things have changed. We're no longer in the engagement era with China. We know that. We're in the post-engagement era, whatever this is. And it's a pendulum that swung very far over to engagement and friendly cooperation, and then it's swung all the way over to very acrimonious rivalry and tech war and trade war and whatever you want to call where we are now. But it could actually swing back to a pragmatic middle. And that's, I believe, what's going to happen in the next 4 years. A pragmatic middle is coming. And that pragmatic middle actually does mean that China would have to address those questions as well. It wouldn't just be them presenting it to us and saying, well, you're going to have to deal with our low-cost labor and our lax labor environment. They're going to have to actually deal with that. And by the way, I was vice chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce of China during China's bid to accede to the GATT, which then became WTO. And we never once argued that China would abide by the rules. We only argued that we'd rather have them inside the tent doing something outside rather than outside the tent aiming at us inside. We thought that it would be purely an effort to just create engagement as a way to have more visibility into what they were doing and more ability to at least influence them in some ways, maybe on the margins. But that was the effort then. That is definitely the effort now. So for what it's worth, I think that it's a difficult thing to do, but it's well worth it.
So, but we have a question from online in a moment about just, if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember Mitch's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu strategy going forward. Harriet, we have somebody online.
Thank you. Yes, we have over 40 people on Zoom today listening in, and we have a couple of questions so far. One is from Catherine Wilhelm, asking you, Mitch, for a clarification. Catherine asks, Mitch, are you arguing that the US should also foster closer coordination between business and government, or even state capitalism? Because what I heard was that the Chinese model may not work for the individual company, which may not make a profit and may die. It only works in the aggregate to build up national wealth and power.
That's a great question, Catherine. So what I'm arguing is we should create an American version of whole of nation effort. It would be very U.S. styled. It wouldn't be sort of the Chinese version where the central government decides that we're going to dominate EVs and then everyone gets around it and entrepreneurs jump in and whatever. But it would be a form where if we look at China as one large corporation, not as just for the moment, just let's look at China as a corporation with the Standing Committee of the Politburo as a very powerful board and Xi Jinping as the executive chairman. In that environment, if you were to think about them as one huge corporation prosecuting their goals and plans around the world, that would be a very accurate depiction of how they're actually achieving such advances in technology and in developing markets and everything they're doing. Now, the American version is much more, I would say, smart bombs, where we have tons and tons of super competitive multinationals. And I always want to include Europe in there because Europe has some amazing, very competitive companies, Mercedes-Benz and Novartis, and there's just a ton of Nestle. There's a ton of them too. But I'm focusing more on the U.S. since we're sitting in Cambridge. For the U.S. to do this, it would require more of a yes, it would require certainly coordination between corporations and government in a different way. Right now, if you look at how policy is socialized in Washington that involves business, there's a little bit, and I say this with love, but there's a little bit of Stockholm syndrome happening right now within the establishment organizations that handle U.S. business relations in China. And that's because that, we've been chastised by policymakers that it was a mistake to offshore our manufacturing to China and everything else we did. We were never set up to try to address national goals of the United States. So we're still not set up for that. What we are set up to do is to coordinate well, and we see this in the United States going back to the late 1800s, public-private partnerships that are very successful, that involve more of an individualistic approach than China's collectivist approach. If you had China Inc. competing against America, it would be tons and tons of super powerful multinationals competing against one super powerful multinational, each one using its advantages. But yes, I definitely think that a little humility and pragmatism would go a long way in the environment we're in right now, that especially just given the abundant evidence that it's not just high-speed rail where China has more than the rest of the world combined. It's not just skyscrapers. 2,800 skyscrapers versus the rest of the world is like less than 1,000. In every area we're starting to see now, China is dominating not just the West, but the entire world in some of these areas. And so it does require us to sort of bend our minds around how we need to be flexible in how we do this. And it absolutely requires that we look at multinationals as part of a solution. Instead of socializing these ideas and business will come back and say, oh, that'll impact our profitability. We need to be consulting with Apple and with Tesla and other companies that are successful in China and saying, hey, how do we turn the page on this? How do we learn from China where they've been successful, but do it in a way that is comfortable to us? And if we're going to have tariffs on China, fine. Let's make tariffs a tactic which is designed to encourage Chinese investment in key industries in the United States and in Europe, as Europe is already doing. Europe already has EV factories under construction that are funded by BYD and other Chinese manufacturers, and we could spread that out into scores of sectors and industries. So yes, sort of I am sort of recommending that.
Susan, please.
Thank you, Mitch, for that really fascinating talk, I must confess. So I'm going to speak as a naive social scientist. Here's a whole lot of language that I'm not that familiar with. And one senses that there's a bunch of embedded assumptions around the talk, like efficiency is good, profits are good, and so forth. But I'm not going to engage with that. I'm going to engage with some of your ideas. So you talk about pragmatism and reciprocity. So you don't need to answer that, but as a social scientist, I'm really interested in knowing concretely, what do those things mean? The concepts are so abstract. What I would really love to do is sit down over that beer and hear how Super 8 became very pragmatic and engaged in reciprocity. But here's what I was thinking about. You threw out the term whole of nation. And it was a concept you were promoting, and it sounded like we should bring all forces together and cooperate and pursue this agenda. But speaking as a more politically oriented social scientist, I start to think, okay, well, first of all, I should say, I studied the use of whole of nation concepts in social policy, in particular on policies involving families, family size, and what it basically amounts to is the party telling young people that they really need to have 2 or 3 kids and they should turn their existing families into old-fashioned, traditional Confucian-style families. So I'm a little worried about that. But whole of nation, there are 2 things underlying that are a bit troubling. One is it involves conflicts. Let's say whole of nation involves 7 different sets of actors. Sure, there are going to be a lot of conflicts among the actors, so who gets to prevail? Secondly, there's always a hierarchy, especially in China, and the party's at the top. So what does that mean for all the other actors? Shouldn't we factor this kind of consideration in before or at the same time that we're advancing all these cool ideas? Naive social science.
Great questions. So just quickly on reciprocity. Reciprocity has been the fervent wish of all of the American people that are involved in China business for the last 40 years. We've never really had it. We always wanted it. We never could quite coordinate ourselves enough to get it, where we were able to say, oh, however China is treating us is how we're going to treat them. One thing for sure is going forward, and I think Professor Erickson would agree, that is a sine qua non for whatever we do going forward with China at this point. And it's frankly something that I would like to see, not just for American interests, but I think in this new era, as I said, we're no longer in the engagement era. China is no longer in the reform era. Whatever it is, it's definitely in the post-Deng Xiaoping, Kaifang era. And the US is no longer the sole hegemon. So in this new world we're in, reciprocity is all about how do we make sure that we're treated fairly? Because I'll be honest, we've never really been treated fairly. Not that Chinese industry members treat each other fairly either, by the way. We tend to think that they were treating us this way. Actually, they're really tough on each other as well. There's not a lot of reciprocity. It's earned in the arena. You get it with blood. You don't just get it. So now we're saying, all right, time for us to have reciprocity. That's kind of where that idea comes from. On the whole of nation idea, there are times, like just thinking about the development of the atomic bomb in the United States, where basically academia and science and corporations and US government all got together and said, we need to build a bomb and we're going to do this together. And we came around, anyone that's watched Oppenheimer, they don't really talk about is how much US industry was involved in that process, but it was very much a process. Now, were certain actors subordinated in that process? Absolutely. I would argue that it's worth at least pushing the envelope of our comfort levels, because the trends are that there's not that many critical technologies anymore that we can still dominate. And it doesn't really serve global stability for the US to be in a supplicant position, which is kind of what I'm concerned about. I mean, I have to say, one thing I really like about our research is that this may be the most patriotic thing I've ever written. If you want to just talk about it, frankly, people, were concerned that I was opening myself up to criticism, but I see no problem with saying, hey guys, I'm seeing this over here, and I think it's really in America's interest, and I think it's really in American business interest that we look at this and maybe revisit some of these ideas of, there are times that it just calls for a moment of review. Anything to add, Davey? Good.
Okay, we have one online and then Professor Goldstein. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a question from one of our online audience members, Carmelita Bowie, who asks, well, first of all says, thank you, Professor Kirby, Mitch, and JB for this presentation. I'm doing my thesis proposal on this topic, examining India, China, and the US. What do you think about China's goal to become the global leader of AI by 2030? And now India also wants to switch from an IT service providing country to developing their own AI software to export to the world. Jensen Huang of NVIDIA unveiled a 4-step plan in Mumbai a few weeks ago to accomplish this. And there's a little bit more. The Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence 2024 annual report reported that China, Saudi Arabia, and India were surveyed as the top-ranking countries for AI positivity. It seems like the emerging market countries are adopting AI innovation and tools much quicker. What do you think the US could do to learn from China and India in this area in order to stay globally competitive moving forward, especially when country membership interest in the BRICS is growing?
Great question. So AI is a very interesting one because it is an area where in the US, we are under the impression that we dominate end to end and that everyone else is kind of playing catch up, maybe with the exception of large language models or large data sets, where China obviously has the advantage of having a much larger set of participants. But actually, in all but one area, China is leading in AI right now, according to ASPI. And so what can we do about it? Well, first of all, we need to live in objective reality. If that's true, we need to then go back and say, how do we go faster? How do we be more practical about commercializing some of this? And how do we make sure that we balance speed and safety in a way that keeps us in competition here. There are some advantages using English as the baseline model and having, basically not just the one thing the U.S. has a huge advantage of. We have many advantages that need to be mentioned, but one of them is the fact that whenever the U.S. does something, we don't just represent ourselves. We represent, an entire developed world which is with us on these things. So when the U.S. is pursuing AI, that means that the Netherlands is pursuing AI the same way, Germany, Japan, Korea. So we have the best of lots of different great nations behind us. So that's one thing we should be doing is getting those nations around these ideas with us. That's not happening right now. Everybody is siloed. Japan is doing their AI, Korea is doing their AI, Germany is doing their AI, US is doing their AI. If we're going to take this seriously, the first thing we need to do is say, all right, we're good at alliances. Granted, under a Trump administration, I expect alliances to be far less emphasized, but nonetheless, in a case of AI where competitiveness is on the line, it would be advisable to look at how we might try to get everybody around these ideas together. Second, when you mentioned China and India, the difference between China and India and the US is those are far more pragmatic, practical markets where no one's going to invest in an idea just for the qiuxiang abstract benefits. It's got to be really definable. How is this going to help us? How is the company going to make money now, not 5 years from now, or whatever? So I would say partnering with Chinese, I know it's very unlikely we're going to be able to partner with Chinese AI companies, just given the security overhang, but certainly Indian companies might have a little bit more headroom there. There might be other countries where we could be doing that. But if we have the advantage, we are an open society, that's our advantage. China does not have that advantage. It's not an open society. So for them, they use their model. Their model is practical, and it's very much a closed-end, whole of nation effort. Ours is much more sort of the rebel alliance of the Star Wars story, where we get together and we can accomplish great things with our diversity. So, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I can add a few data points.
Please.
Especially with China. China's AI development, I think, is a big testament to its ability to develop on its own. And without the West, I mean, it's doubled its semiconductor self-sufficiency to 40%. And their goal is to eliminate foreign technology use in their critical sectors by 2027. China leads global AI publications with 40% of all worldwide AI research papers. China's currently outpacing the US in quantum technologies. It's now kind of launched its first open source OS. And so this is all just showing that China is shifting to be less reliant and less dependent on the West, and a testament to our further point that trying to sort of pursue these end-to-end solutions without China is sort of not achievable. That's why Mitch and I are arguing for the leveraging. Like, the end goal is the same, but we are arguing that you need to keep China involved in our way of engagement, and this is the way to go. I mean, another example is that when the US completely cut off tech transfer to China, in 1998, NASA cut off, and the US cut off all space tech transfer to China. And now within 20 years, the China space program is now comparable to the US. In fact, they lead the US in some space-related technologies, just to show that they are perfectly capable on their own to sort of develop and innovate quickly. So we need to sort of, like Mitch said, keep that Brazilian jiu-jitsu move and figure out ways to leverage and partner for Western benefit that includes China in that. And I think AI, yeah.
So before we turn to Professor Goldstein, who runs the Fairbank Center Taiwan Studies Workshop, I think it's worth noting that, maybe the single most innovative place on Earth, certainly per square acre in AI, is in Greater China, but not on mainland China. Happens to be in Taiwan. But now to you, Steve.
I wasn't going to talk about Taiwan. I'm looking at it from the other perspective, Mitch. That is, it's pretty much recognized that China is making advances in all of these areas. But the question that I ask myself is, what's the impact on the Chinese economy as a whole? And what's the impact on the trajectory of the Chinese economy. And there, this technology has been bought at a very high price. It's created high debt. It's created, it emerges from diversion into military investment. It leaves behind also makes more difficult China's development out of a middle income country. The one thing that the Chinese have not accomplished is to build consumption within China and remain dependent on international. You're just increasing that. And that is not necessarily a positive thing for moving China out of the middle income trap. So I would just stress that this is a costly enterprise by a country that does not have a lot of investment except by the state, resulting in large debt, both local and national, and the difficulties of moving out of the middle income category.
Great.
So it may be good advice for the United States, but are you giving the Chinese good advice?
It's a great question. That's great. Thank you, Professor. Couple thoughts. One, you're right. I agree with every word you just said. I think, like I said, China's economy is very much a Schrodinger's cat. If you look at it at the granular level, local debt, the burden placed on Chinese workers, unemployment, demographics. I mean, I could easily, and Dan Rosen at Rhodium, a good friend, could easily paint a great picture that China isn't even growing, and that their economy is in a terrible state, and that they're really on the verge of collapse. I could also paint a story which is a very different story about an economy which has dominated so many of the fourth industrial revolution technologies now that they're well set up for things. Then they can absorb the short-term challenges that they're facing. The thing that's interesting to me, I think, is the consumption question, because ultimately, one way or the other, 说来说去, right, you're going to have to come back to the idea that China has to address its domestic consumption. Now, here's one interesting thought I've had just since we learned about President Trump's reelection, which is that he's going to institute tariffs which are going to include export restrictions and other things on Chinese, and a lot of Chinese areas where they're reliant. It may force President Xi's hand to take much more robust measures to enhance their own domestic consumption story. They can't sanction the U.S. or tariff the U.S. to the same level. Yeah, they can go after our agriculture and a few things, but ultimately, on the market access game, I think the U.S. has got a pretty strong hand. But when it comes to looking at how we could, work with China in new ways, I think you might find that they might benefit from an imperative which doesn't currently exist for them to put much more attention on their consumption story, and that is ultimately how they're going to get out of the middle income trap. Also, the other thing is interesting, and I've heard this from very good friends at Beida, where I talk to my professors and folks quite often, and what they say is, you could look at the Chinese economy as falling off a cliff, or you could look at it as in the middle of a transition from one type of economy to another. And as I said, it's Schrodinger's cat. It may exist in both states at the same time. So I think instead of trying to, like Schrodinger's cat, figure out which it is, we sort of accept, what is true ceteris paribus, regardless of whether their story is a declining story or a changing story. I don't have all the answers to that question at all, and I'm very much out of my lane talking about it. I'm sure there's other folks in the room who are much more, not to mention Dr. Kirby, I'm sure knows much more about this topic. But for my part, I would like to suggest that, some of these ideas are agnostic to timing and sentiment and some of the things we're looking at, because China does dominate in these areas right now. So regardless of where it's going and the challenges that they're clearly facing, just right now, just for our own selfish purposes, it would be really useful to look at how we might harness some of their strengths in areas that are clear wins. I wish the US had high-speed rail. I mean, I've ridden on Chinese high-speed rail. I think anyone that's ridden high-speed rail or sat in a Xiaomi or a Neo car, I'd like to have access to some of that stuff. And I'd also like to make sure that we think we're creating a castle around us, but I don't want that castle to turn into a prison where we find ourselves isolated. And that may sound like a crazy idea, it may sound fringe, but let's talk in 2 years. It may not be so fringe if we continue down the path we're on. So that's what I would say. JB, do you have anything to add? No.
I think we're at our time. So a final comment from the co-author? A great credit to the St. Paul School?
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, as you can tell, I'm a much younger demographic. I'm a senior in high school, but I think the topic of US-China relations sort of means a lot to me. My mom is Chinese and my dad is American. I was born in Beijing and I lived there till I was 8 and then moved to the US. So I think at my age, I understand sort of US and Chinese culture and the sort of dynamic better than a lot of people, and sort of seeing this relationship as sort of the most important bilateral relationship of my life, certainly trying to figure out a way to sort of make a change or make an impact is something that's meaningful to me. And so I'm very grateful for Mitch to give me this platform and opportunity to work with him. I mean, the 11 months we worked together, the amount of sort of articles I've read through, sort of interviews I've done, writing I've done, I mean, this has just been probably the most impactful sort of thing I've done up to date. And so, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for having me here today. And yeah.
Well, thank you for coming, Mitch. Jamie, thank you both very, very much.
I do recommend